Right, hello everybody and welcome back to Dan's Astrology. Today is December the 19th, and what I am planning to do for this video is talk about basically aspects being made by the planet Neptune. Mercury is stationed retrograde, and Mercury will be squaring Neptune. The Sun is currently applying a square to Neptune from Sagittarius, and Mars is in Sagittarius as well. Mars will be making the square to Neptune. And so, yeah, basically, all these planets, which are in the third decan of Sagittarius, are making aspects to Neptune. And there's another part of this which is important to consider, that Mercury retrograde, once it completes the retrograde, once it stations direct and then moves back into Capricorn, and then there's this period of time called the retrograde shadow. Once that period is complete and Mercury reaches the degree it was at when it stationed retrograde, at that exact moment Pluto makes its ingress into Aquarius. And so there's something about this Mercury retrograde and it squares to Neptune, and the marking of Pluto into Aquarius that, basically there's certain themes that go with Neptune that have a lot to do with kinds of things like the spiritual delusion or the spiritual calling, but how that can kind of get mixed up and confused. And then with Aquarius, there's often this kind of thing about like improving and transforming and evolving, and sometimes that gets mixed up with different organizations like religious groups and cults and stuff like that. And just in their last little while, I watched between last video that I made and this video, I watched the cult documentary Love Has Won, Mother God, and I thought it was an interesting documentary, and I've been kind of like I've just been kind of processing it since I watched it, and I haven't really said anything online about it. And I'm a guy who likes a good cult documentary, but this one stands out as being sort of fundamentally different than some of the other ones. I will sort of there's the Osho one, and now Osho was named Rajneesh, but he changed his name to Osho shortly before his death. But there's that one, Wild Wild Country. There's the one about NXVM, which is very like. There's something about it. The NXVM one really sort of tapped into this kind of like entrepreneur success, like self-development. They had these like large group trainings, large group awareness training kind of things that kind of pass it off as a kind of like professional development seminar, but really it's a cult. And they had it was an international thing, but they got pretty big or whatever, right? And then there's a documentary about Teal Swan. Teal Swan is a famous YouTuber, and I don't necessarily... This is what's kind of interesting, is that if you look at all these different cult groups and documentaries, that I had been aware of Teal Swan for many years, regardless of any documentary about her. And she's kind of like, to me, Teal Swan kind of fits this position that, like, if you're into that kind of stuff, she's popular enough that you'd probably hear about her. But I thought this Mother God one was kind of interesting, because I don't know, like, she only had a small group of people that were with her, and I don't think, she didn't seem like she was really all that successful. And also, like, the thing is, like, with the Osho documentary, Osho and his group ended up being armed with, like, AK-47s and, like, engaged in these, like, trying to, like, poison the local population to try to swing votes. And there was, like, the Osho thing was an extreme mess. And in contrast to all this stuff, the only thing that really happened with the Mother God people was that they were extremely unhealthy, had addiction problems, do not really they don't really get into the stuff about whether or not there's any legitimate spiritual thing to them, because if you just watch the film, they kind of come they don't it's not a very flattering documentary in terms of the actual cult itself. They I don't want to come off as seeming like judgmental or superior, because I'm just some guy who's I whatever. I don't. Who am I to judge anybody? Who am I to put myself in some kind of superior position? But like, they didn't really. They seemed like a bunch of losers or a bunch of morons or a bunch of bozos, and I don't want to use the wrong language or whatever. But that's like, they don't seem like they have much opportunity to be taken seriously. And the whole thing is that, like, they didn't. The only person that really got hurt from this was the cult leader herself. And so, in some way, like, you could think of, I don't know, this is just on my mind for some reason, the fact that, like, when you think about cult groups and erecting some person into some position of being a supreme leader, that person could do a lot of really abusive things in that position, but this person really was just self-destructive, right? And it was actually more of the issue was the complacency of the people around her in that kind of self-destructive attitude, right? But why am I getting into this? Again, there's something going on with this about Pluto into Aquarius and all these squares to Neptune. And if we just back up a little bit, like, there's something that happened when around the time that Mercury stationed retrograde, is that personally I have been avoiding social media, and I've been reading lots of books. And there's something about doing this, is that it's like I feel like I've trained myself away from using social media, so that when I do look on Facebook, like, I have a very difficult time paying attention to it for very long, or being really that invested in anything that goes on in Facebook. And so but I have this sort of, like, I have to also admit that in the I've been going through something recently where, well, as you may know, I'm a Sagittarius sun, and I had my birthday not long ago. And I have a tendency to get a little bit depressed maybe around my birthday, but I have made a resolution, and also with the holiday season and all this kind of stuff, I think often brings up these feelings for people. And I have basically come up with this kind of resolution that I'm not going to complain about anything, and also keeping in mind that there's this whole conflict of war between Israel and Palestine. People talk about, like, the world ending and stuff like that. I'm basically just looking at my life and what I've got, and that I am in a position where even the very basics of life, that I don't have to worry about my local area around me being some sort of war zone, and that I'm not, maybe certain things that might have to do with my standing or position in society, or my relation to my family and friends. Maybe it's not ideal, but it's not so. There's not such big problems. It's like, it's not entirely a bad. I mean, even that is just comparing things. But, like, there's a basic principle that I'm looking at all the stuff going on in the world, and if I'm going to make a contribution by recording, astrology videos, I want to make something that is not just wallowing in all the problems or whatever, and I want to express sort of gratitude and enthusiasm for being here and all this kind of stuff, right? But I have to also admit that there's this basic issue around feeling lonely and having a desire for connection with other people. And I suppose it was just of this basic feeling. And that, the thing about the internet, that's what social media is, basically, is that you have this sort of, these programs, these apps, these platforms that promise you this instant connection with other people, and instant opportunity to form groups and communities around shared interest, and all this positive stuff, and yet it turns like there's something about it that like it's like it's like trying to fill some sort of void, but only filling it with like junk food or something. Like that's kind of what it feels like to me, because it's like I could spend all day on social media and I'm still just staring at a screen. Even the thing, there's this thing about like now we have, you know, video communication and you can talk to people with voice and stuff like that, and like I think that gives a more of a sense of actually connecting with another human being. But I just have this thing where I had this desire to be with actual human beings in person, in an actual community, kind of, you know, like a real life, physical body, people doing stuff. And, you know, if I ever sort of express anything along the lines of that sentiment on social media, I basically just have friends that don't socialize with me, friends that are even I'm not even talking about internet friends. I'm talking about friends that I knew from high school will just be like, well, you could get a job, you know. And it's like, this is the whole thing, is like, you know, it's like there's this kind of issue going back to the whole thing about the cult documentary. It was one of the things that I found interesting anyways, was that I somehow felt this need that I needed to, like, you know, I wasn't using social media and I needed to communicate something. So I decided, you know what I'll do? I'll just do a live stream video and I'll just talk on live stream and just sort of, I wasn't even sure what I was going to say, to be honest, but I would just like kind of riff and kind of talk and just see where it goes. And to be honest, I think I kind of just repeated a lot of the things that I have said on social media already before. But there's still this sort of like this kind of like avoiding the social media platforms, but still feeling like there's like a missed opportunity to connect with people. Or it could also be that it's like Christmas time and people are like expecting, like, you know, people want to check in with their friends or something, and I'm just avoiding it. I don't know what's going on, right? But there's something about all this, which I was in that video. I ended up going into this kind of like, for some reason I was talking about health, right? And I was talking about how, because like a lot of the people I might connect with online, there's this whole thing about like the health and wellness thing, which to be honest, like I've never really explicitly tried to make connections with people who are in some kind of like health and wellness what can I say? Oh wow, nice big bald eagles flying through my window there. Well, not through my window, but I can see bald eagles flying around outside. Um, I was basically making this point that was like, one of the things I'm doing is trying to read Friedrich Nietzsche, and he's a guy who did have health problems, but he talked about like his philosophical issues weren't just intellectual things. They were things that he was processing at like a bodily level, that, you know, he was taking the problems of like the death of God and the crisis of meaning and stuff like that so seriously that he was like making himself sick, you know. And it's like this kind of like attitude that like if you are that, you know, that there's a certain experience, there's a reality that exists, and that, you know, there's not to say that there's anything like you shouldn't try to be healthy. Like I'm not saying that, right? But that there's the whole spectrum of human experience contains all sorts of different states that one can get in, and that by going through different trials and tribulations, that you may have a more. We're talking about like the idea of like wholeness, right? And that wholeness may include all sorts of things that aren't considered to be healthy, right? But it was kind of funny because then like after I was talking about this kind of stuff, just kind of riffing in this live stream video. There was also, to be honest, it was like an hour long, and I don't even know how many people would have watched the whole thing. But I ended up watching this video about the Mother God cult, and the main issue being completely unhealthy, right? And how the like I have a little show and tell for you, because I just to admit that I'm, to say that I'm not like, for the sake of transparency, right? Because we're all human and we're all transparent, right? That in recovering from my own health problems, you guys don't have to hear about all of it, but one of the things that, like, I was having a bit of psoriasis that's cleared up now, but sometimes I get a bit of dry skin stuff, and I went to my local, healthcare, what is it, health food, supplement, vitamin stores, and asked the guy what he recommended there, and he recommended this product, which is, as you can see, colloidal silver and organic aloe, right? Now, I have to admit that I have tried also just using aloe vera on its own as a moisturizer, and but there's something about the colloidal silver with organic aloe that I don't know if it's just a psychosomatic thing, but I feel like it provides some kind of a relief that just using aloe vera on its own doesn't provide. Now the thing is, I'm just putting this topically on dry skin, and it's probably not in high enough a dose that it's going to cause me any problems. But there's this whole world of alternative health care and alternative healing and stuff like this, right? That, like, people, well, like, if you look at this documentary that came out, what this woman died from was basically said to be anorexia combined with alcohol abuse, and basically taking ridiculous amounts of colloidal silver shots, right? Just like ingesting it into your body. And it got, like, I don't want to, like, well, whatever. This is a, spoilers included in here, that she was one of these people that, like, she ended up, like, her face turned all silver, and it's actually quite horrific, right? And there's this kind of thing that, like, okay, this is the whole thing about Neptune, right? Is that Neptune, why I'm tying it with the astrology, is that Neptune in astrology represents the confusion that comes from a lack of differentiation, right? In the same way, it's also connected with, sometimes with these issues around, how Sigmund Freud had this sort of stripped down idea, like, there's this conflict between Freud and Jung, where Jung was much more interested in what we would talk about as a kind of a spiritual dimension, whereas Sigmund Freud basically, like, he saw religion as basically being a kind of a regressive thing, like people were regressing to earlier stages of development, where instead of using developed adult logic, they were using magical thinking. And so, like, for him, from the Freudian perspective, all sort of religion and mysticism is a kind of a regression back to the womb into a state of undifferentiated consciousness, right? And that the more that you develop and the more you become adult, the more you move away from that kind of thing, and take on adult responsibilities and all this kind of stuff. The thing about this whole thing about health, though, right, is that, or the whole pretense of, the idea of expanded awareness, expanded consciousness, and all this kind of stuff, is that if your primary concern was the health of the human body and all this kind of stuff, and you had a basic awareness of the grounded, fit world around you, then you should be able to see that if you are using a certain product and it's only making you sicker, and you're only becoming more poisoned and unhealthy, and if your goal is health of the body, health of the physical form, you should be able to at least see that you are doing something that isn't what you want, and to make some sort of adjustment and to make some sort of change and adapt to the circumstance. But these people are apparently not able to do this. They're kind of just fixed into this direct court. But the other side of it, though, is there's this kind of issue of course, these people are just like, and there's also this whole sort of differentiation of like choosing, if you're on a spiritual path, are you using drugs and alcohol, or are you choosing to abstain, or are you, things about like sex or something like that, right? Like. And there's a lot of New Agers who say that for them there is no distinction for them between their sex life and their spiritual life, right? And that there's no reason to have this sort of like, like the old Christian like chastity or something like that, or like the nuns have to live in a convent and like you have to have the women and the men separated. This is like in this cult or whatever, like she basically, she was Mother God, and whoever she was sleeping with was Father God, and that she ended up just going through quite a series of different partners. And there's this kind of thing about like this idea of filling the void, as I would say, right? Which is from a Deleuzian, Bergsonian kind of perspective. Like, what Bergson would say is that there isn't the void, or the non-existence is kind of a false problem, right? Because he has this idea that, like, if you think about sound, right? And you have a kind of like the backdrop of silence, right? That you can probably hear there's like somebody using a hedge trimmer or something like that outside, right? And that you can hear the hedge trimmer appear as a kind of a vibration, and then it stops, right? And then it starts again, and then it stops, or whatever, right? And in relative to the sound of the hedge trimmer outside, there is a kind of a break or a silence or a kind of an emptiness there. And the idea from a Bergsonian perspective is that the absence of the sound isn't really, it's not like there's the absence of something is a total negation, but rather it's the space in which things arise, right? But there are still certain things, like when we talk about like the existential void in society, or the existential void is that like there is a like, let's say, like one of the things that the reasons why I relate to this is that it's not really, there's an existential void that is created not by the emptiness, the silence, but rather what it is we decide to choose to fill the silence or the emptiness with. And if we look at, for example, in this cult documentary, what happened with this woman in terms of like what was her life like before she ran off and became a New Ager, right? She worked at McDonald's for another number of years. She had a series of relationships which didn't sound very healthy. She ended up having a few kids, and she's more or less judged because, I mean, there's like sort of like this weird kind of contradiction or kind of hypocritical thing in saying that, like, calling herself, using the word mother, to call herself Mother God, and then to drop her parental responsibilities and basically run away to become a New Ager, right? But there's this kind of thing about like there's something about the this idea that like if there is some kind of transcendent eternal truth, that truth is going to be there regardless. But there's something about the whole culture that we're in, about with fast food and McDonald's and there's a lot of stuff that we have to deal with in life that is, and this is the whole thing, it's not the presence of, it's not like McDonald's, like because we eat a Big Mac, God is dead or something like that, whatever I try to say. Like, it's, what I'm trying to say is that I relate to this, and I think it's a prime example of some of the stuff that Gilles Deleuze was talking about, because if you could compare this to like Henry Miller leaving his wife and kids and running off to France, right? Or you could compare this with something like William S. Burroughs shooting his wife, abandoning his children, running off to Tangiers or something like this, which is not to say that that was a good thing to do, which is not to say that it's a moral thing to do, but there's this kind, if you think about the normal life as being a kind of like a pipeline, that people are, human life is like this, going along this kind of fixed set path of this is what society says you're supposed to do, and there are these ruptures and bursts of what Deleuze and Guattari call lines of flight away from working at McDonald's, being a responsible parent, and then part of the Deleuzian schizo-analysis is basically saying, rather than a Freudian perspective would be like, what do we have to do to get this woman to go back to her family, to go back to working at McDonald's, to go back to basically complying with the world as it is. Whereas Deleuze would be looking at it in terms of, do you see the trajectory that the line of flight is on becomes a self-destructive thing, because there's this the mundane material reality, and there's the pretense of some sort of search for transcendence, or the search for basically, I don't know about you, but there's something about, there's this thing about soul, right? That James Hillman talks about with soul, and the idea that the soul is inherently something that's maybe a little bit more transcendent, but the soul comes down to earth to inhabit the body. And that, there's this whole thing about things like attention deficit disorder, or the different problems involved in interfacing with the reality around you. And I would argue that, if you go to like a busy shopping mall, or a fast food restaurant, or like a big like Amazon warehouse, if you have to work, like there's this question is like, does the soul want to be in this environment, right? And one of the things about these sort of like the New Age movement and these cult documentaries is, you notice one of the things that they do is that these people ended up going camping for long periods of time, and they're involved in nature for long periods of time. Is that I think everybody even people who don't identify as being like New Agers or something like that, they feel a resonance with being in nature, and that resonance is like the soul which is hidden kind of comes out a little bit. The soul gets to poke its head around and and it's like, oh, the soul likes this environment, right? Whereas then you try to like be a burger flipper, and the soul just wants to check out. The soul is like, fuck, I just want to drink a whole bunch when I get off work. I don't like being here, And then the soul, and this is also what, Deleuze and Guattari make this kind of argument that it's kind of a little bit complicated, but the Freud had this idea about a death drive, right? And Deleuze and Guattari say that they don't believe there is such thing as a death drive itself, that is not an assemblage, right? That isn't like, the death drive comes from looking at a certain set of circumstances, and making a kind of an evaluation and saying, this sucks, maybe it would be better to die. Right? And then, but you can't, and then this may be in the situation of this cult, though. The woman is like, and woman and all her cult members are slowly poisoning her, and she's slowly dying, but she wants to say, keep it positive, everybody, keep it all just good vibrations. But there's this sort of dissociated death drive, there's this will to death that is like, and I have this is one thing that I was trying to at least express or explain, that there's something about the environment of, like, you're in suburbia and all the houses look perfectly and all the lawns are manicured and all the hedges are perfectly trimmed, and it's like, well, all your ducks are in a row, but it makes it like, I don't feel like, it doesn't make me feel like being here. It doesn't, it's like, yeah, and this whole thing of, like, you don't know your neighbors, you just see all these perfectly manicured lawns and luxury cars, and the soul is like, well, great, can I go somewhere else? Can I like, if I have to stay here, can I lose myself in the bottle? Can I lose myself in drugs and alcohol? Can I lose myself in, random sexual encounters or something like that? And we're always chasing this thing because we're like, and there's this kind of question of, like, can we make the action, like, and I'm not interested in, like there's other really obvious things that go with the whole cult dynamic where it's like, you can't accept the fact that you are just a average, mediocre person, so you have to invent some grandiose identity for yourself. Like, and like everybody in the cult ends up having these, like, names that are like these grandiose identities because they can't live with the basic, mundane realities of day-to-day life and all this. But there's this, it doesn't have to be a binary opposition between some crazy ungrounded cult and working at McDonald's or some job that you hate or something like this. And I basically relate to this because, like, at one point in time I was working, and I was working at a department store, right? And I eventually left and I worked other jobs or whatever. But, like, the people that work at that department store still work there, right? And people, like, for some people, that's, I guess apparently they can just do that. They can just have one job that isn't anything fancy, that isn't anything special, and they can just keep that job and work there for decades and decades and decades and not fucking go crazy, right? Like, I don't know how people do that, right? But the whole thing is, like, there's this whole idea too that, like, when these people, there's a bunch of people who apparently left that kind of lifestyle to go live in a cult, and the cult, like, I find it, like, relatable in some way because, like, it would be great to have a bunch of like-minded people that you live together with, and if you have far out kind of experiences or ideas, then you could talk about them or something like that. But obviously there's a risk of that being unhealthy, and one of the things about these cults too is that there's a bad reputation that comes out of them in terms of being like a new age grifter, right? That instead of providing some sort of product or service that is legitimate, you are basically selling people a bunch of garbage, or you're just making stuff up. And one of the things about, I don't make any claims or whatever. If I'm going to do astrology chart readings for people, I don't make any claims that these, it's more of an experiment, like, show me your chart, give me your birth info, and I'll see what it looks like, and I'll see what comes out of it. And I don't make any claims that it's going to solve all your problems or do anything for you. And if anything, in my own experience of reading charts, is that instead of using this as a pretense to, like, instead of dealing with ordinary mundane life, you are becoming ungrounded and dealing with these interdimensional entities or something like that, that the astrology points back towards the mundane realities of your life, and it describes the situation as it is in a way that could be very practical. You're not looking at the stars as a way to escape the ordinary, mundane reality of your life, right? And so, but at the same time, the ordinary, mundane reality of your life, it's like, I kind of had this attitude about the actual circumstances where I live. Like, for example, I don't drive a car, right? And I've been thinking about getting my driver's license. But the part of the reason why I'm, this is an issue for me is because if given the neighborhood that I'm in, and I have to admit, there may be certain places where I could live that would be even worse than this, right? But in the neighborhood where I live, in walking distance, you have a liquor store, pub, you have a gas station, and you have a Tim Hortons, right? And the gas station and the Tim Hortons a gas station is a gas station. It's the only thing it sells there are what are intended to be roadside snacks that you can, if you need, to eat a candy bar on your way to getting real food. And then Tim Hortons is, even the little Tim Hortons has a drive-through, right? And so it's like the whole structure of the environment is built in such a way that it's built for people who drive. And it's not built in such a way that, like, if you needed to get groceries, if you needed to do basic life stuff, and you didn't, you could take the bus, but, there's this basic thing that it's like we have a world built for drivers, built for car users, and that if you're not a car user, you're basically like a subhuman. You're like a lower class citizen. You're basically like, I'm not even, there's also this whole thing about me feeling kind of like lonely and not having friends. It's like, if I were to go on a dating app and being like, hey, yeah, I'm somebody who's in my 30s and I don't drive a vehicle, then, just being somebody that doesn't drive a car and that, it basically puts me in a kind of a strata of human beings where it's like it's being like a caste system. You're like an untouchable, basically, because you have a choice that is, there's this thing, a certain form of technology that hasn't even been, what is it? It's about 100 years old. It's not like human beings have always lived with automobiles, and it's like our God-given right to go and drive cars around, and this is how life ought to be. This is just something that we came up with. And it's like, it's this thing where if you want to be a valid human being in society, you have to comply with a car, right? You have to and then you have to there's this whole normal way of doing things. It's kind of, I find it interesting because McDonald's and fast food has only been around since what, like the 1960s? It's not even stuff that's been around for very long. And there's this kind of thing about you could also look at things like the issue of like Neptune with intoxication and drug use and people looking to chasing states of bliss, right? I'm just gonna do drugs and be blissed out or something like that, right? But there's this whole thing about like taking that as a kind of a cause and effect. Like, this person uses a drug and then, the drug must have had an effect on them. Now they're all weird and they want to join a cult. But what about the McDonald's? What about, could you consider that, all these people have to put up with this McDonald's world, and it just in, the fucking, hedge trimmer world, and, that just starts eating, we have to have all our hedges being these, perfectly weird, square, unnatural shapes or whatever, right? Or nothing like anything you'd see in nature, and we have to have all these perfectly manicured lawns. This is one of the things that I had a problem with Facebook, because I was trying to basically have a crack at expressing this issue, and my friends just say, you should just stop complaining and get a job, right? Go back to McDonald's. You start flipping burgers. And first of all, this kind of thing of why does it have to be fast food? Why does it have to be Walmart? This is we're not, it's not like this is the world has to be this way. Why can't we make a world where people can show up and go to work and raise their families and not feel like they want to die and kill themselves and run off and join cults? That whole thing is completely unnecessary, because the world that we actually have is in harmony with, some whatever people are looking for. People feel like they have to run away and do all this stuff because there's something about, like, why can't the way we actually structure our society. And I'll give you an example, is that, like, when I went to Australia, I met a lot of people that were into permaculture. And then when I came back here, I ended up telling my family about, like, I don't like this whole certain way of doing, because, like, there's no real reason why your lawn has to look like that. Because if you go with the actual, like, science of it, and you're creating an ecological dead zone, whereas you could create habitats that are, for one thing, lower maintenance, in that you don't have to constantly mow lawns, you don't have to constantly trim things, that they are more self-regulating, right, on one hand, and that these things also become more environmentally friendly. They become habitats for different kinds of wildlife, and it helps to support the ecosystem. But instead we have this whole culture where it's like we have to pave over everything with concrete, we have to have perfectly manicured lawns that are completely inhospitable to any kinds of life, and we have to turn everything into a big shopping mall, concrete strip mall wasteland. And it's like, I don't think, like, having a reaction against that, I don't think that is necessarily a sign that you are sick. I think there's something sort of thing. And now we look at these cult documentaries, which are obviously unhealthy. And we say, like, we create this kind of binary polarization where, this is the right, proper way to do things, and this is what those crazy weirdos are like. And I'm like, it's like the whole thing between, like, which Slavoj Zizek says about the Matrix, when you're given the red pill and the blue pill, where's the third pill? Or, like, why do we have to be, we don't have to be stuck with these simple binary oppositions, and you don't have to fall into, like, you're either this or you're either that, and you can essentially be willing to do something that's completely different, that doesn't give in to either of those two sides, right? And yeah, basically this is one thing that I'm considering too. I have to admit that this whole project of mine, doing astrology videos, is like, I'm basically doing it at this point in time without any. I'm not really that serious about this as something that I can use as a career, something that I can make. I have, made a bit of money doing natal chart readings for people, but one of the things about this is that I'm not trying to, like, engineer this in such a way that I get the maximum audience of people that are just easy to make money from, or people that are just easy to do charts for, because I feel like there's certain thing in that whole, what am I trying to say? There's something about the whole world of New Agers and that I don't feel like that's the right path for me. I don't feel like I'm a typical New Age person. And there's also, I have to admit, there's a problem with that documentary or that certain group where, because I'm not into Donald Trump, I would basically see, like, the fact that these people speak favorably about Donald Trump, that these people speak favorably about QAnon, that for me those would just be red flags, and that I just wouldn't investigate it any further than that. And but I feel like if you just kind of leave if you kind of have this system where you have certain preferences or certain choices mark as these red flags where you don't have to think about it any further. Like, oh, this person likes Donald Trump. This person uses colloidal silver. This person is a person who uses the words like ascension. Like, this is one thing is that I quickly, whatever. It was just something that I just didn't. I ran into some of these people in like the psychedelic community or the festival circuit of the kind of people that talk about spirituality in terms of like ascension and 5D and all, and it just something about it just never vibed for me. It was never really the kind of thing that felt like the place where it intuitively, like, you know, if you're intuitive, you should be able to intuit that you know, this is kind of sketchy, or that these people sound a bit ungrounded or something. But I don't want to, like, you know, the whole thing of throw the baby out with the bathwater. But sometimes there's a question: is there a baby with the bathwater to be thrown out anyways, right? And this is the whole image of, like, that's also very Neptune, right? Like, is it the whole thing just a polluted mess, or is there actually something in there that's redeemable? But these documentaries don't really seem to do anything favorable in terms of, you know, presenting a side of it that you could take seriously, right? So, like, this is the whole thing, is that I don't want to, like, with these videos, I don't tend to go in that direction at all. I prefer to do a kind of astrology that's grounded to the actual world around you, that is basically, if there's a consensus reality, a plane of consistency that we all share, that astrology ought to be relevant and comprehensible to this consensus shared reality that we all inhabit, and that astrology isn't running away from life, but rather astrology points us back to life and back to what goes on in life. But at the same time, I do sympathize with, basically, there's reasons why we find the physical environment, the social environment, and basically the world around us to be something that the soul doesn't want to be there. The soul wants to get the fuck out of there, right? And that's why there's this whole issue about, like, seeking this escapism, right? Whether that's escapism through alcohol or weird belief systems or whatever, and like this whole thing of, like, you know, maybe it's more responsible to find a kind of a work, you know, the thing about, what's been on my mind recently is that, you know, like, not everybody believes in astrology, but if your car, even if you're the weirdest new ager in the world, if your car is broken and it doesn't start, you're going to need a mechanic, right? If your roof is leaky, you're going to need a roofer. So we can respect that these kinds of jobs are, you know, regardless of your belief system, there is practical work that needs to be done, and we need people to do that work, and it doesn't make sense to challenge that side of things. But when, like, you know, there's this, during the pandemic, there was these things like, you know, nobody wants to work anymore. We can't find anybody who wants to work at Tim Hortons. We can't find enough people to work at McDonald's. Well, I'm just like, why do we need to have, like, maybe we shouldn't. You know, maybe all these people, you know, we should just, if you're looking for a job, don't go to work at Tim Hortons. Don't go to work at McDonald's. Don't go to work at Walmart. Just, you know, these corporations can't exist if there isn't anybody who's there to fill the positions. And the whole thing is, like, you know, maybe to some degree, if we're talking about food distribution, we're going to need people to distribute food, to grow food and all that in one way or another. But can we not make the world a more hospitable place for the human soul? Why not? Right? Like, and I mean, and this is one thing, is that I'm basically considering trying to either go back to work, because obviously, I mean, this thing I'm doing here, like, I'm not getting enough people who want to do astrology readings to make this a viable business. But I don't know, there's no reason why not to just do video blogs, right? But like, and the thing is, I'm not actually under that much financial pressure right now that it's like, I think that there's certain things, like some of these jobs that are the kinds of jobs that you don't, like, given the choice, you may not want to work these jobs, right? But a lot of times people may just people need to get a job, or else they'll be homeless, or else they won't have any money, or else they can't pay the bills, or they can't put food on the table, right? And then out of sheer necessity, and out of, you have a resume and you have a certain skill set or a certain kind of, you are a valid candidate for a certain kind of work, and then through this process of just trying to find whatever job will take you, you end up working this, and you end up just making it work, even if it's not the ideal situation. Fortunately, I'm not in that position. And I could go to school, and I could, like, become more educated, and like, there's these kinds of things of, like, this, people want you to have a good career, so you're not just stuck working at a grocery store or flipping burgers or something like that. And I'm trying to figure out, like, a different kind of career path or something like that. But I want to basically affirm the consensus reality, the real world, and that the astrology that I do confirms that real world. But with the thing about Neptune is that there's this sort of, like, there is this desire to either transcend or escape, or, just numb yourself out with drugs and alcohol and something like that. And I think there's something important about looking at how, in this case of this cult documentary, why it's like this. It kind of, like, people kind of have this idea, like, there's nothing fundamentally wrong with substances, or there's nothing wrong, like, if you think there's something wrong with sex, you're a prude or something like that. But then you look at this kind of cult documentary, all the things that this person is doing wrong is not differentiating between the spiritual path and the path of bodily pleasure, of having parties and drinking, of having, multiple sexual partners, of just indulging the body and indulging that it even includes the emotional connection, right? Because I think that to some degree our emotional human need for connection with other people, like, if you were to be, I'm just going to be stone sober, and I'm going, instead of trying to chase after a community of people that give me the sense of belonging, I'm going to just be a hermit and live out in the woods, and I'm not going to use drugs and alcohol to put myself in some sort of stupor. There's this kind of thing about, like, this is with Pluto into Aquarius, and I am kind of borrowing from Adam Ellenboss here, because he was talking in terms of the human transcending away from the animal, right? That there is Nietzsche was talking about how church and religion is basically playing off of the animal need for herd security, right? To be in a group, to feel like you are sharing a group experience with other people, gives us a sense of shared security, much in the same way that a grazing gazelle will feel more at home and secure with a large herd of gazelle. It's basically an animal instinct to form different groups and different like, Marshal McLuhan talks about this in terms of the media, that even if I'm just alone in my bedroom, but I'm doing this video and uploading it to YouTube, then that is a way for me to connect with a larger, like, the herd, right? It seems like it's a very cold and detached thing because it's just through technology and media, but what is driving it is essentially the need for community involvement, herd involvement, right? And that we submit this sort of these videos to these social media platforms where people can like them and subscribe, and you can see your number. And McLuhan talks about how numbers are basically connected to the affect of group involvement. How big is the army? How big is the congregation? How big is your workforce, right? And that the more numbers you have on, the more followers you have, it's like having your own little army of people who support you or something like this. And then if we feel like if we're not getting any numbers on social media, it's like being alone and being isolated. And then, but if we have a lot of viewers, if we have a lot of followers, if you have then it's like, it's the animal feels security in connecting with other animals. And so like this is the kind of thing is that maybe. And with Neptune, there's this kind of like this differentiation process that everything's mixed up. There's this like there's this Neptune thing that's like that you can have your cake and eat it too, right? Where you're like, and like people might use non-duality like this. There's no difference between there's no difference between my connection with God and my connection with my little kid that I'm nursing as my baby or something like that. Whereas like, maybe there is a distinction. Maybe we do have to make a distinction. And then there's this whole thing about the where the angelic or the transcendent becomes very unhuman, right? And so people don't want to go there, or there's this kind of problem where there could be pitfalls and perils in either direction, right? And I think, anyways, this resonates both with all the squares to Neptune that we're going to have, as well as Pluto into Aquarius. And the first decan of Aquarius has to do with, like, independence, separating from the group, or becoming... Yeah, I mean, so, I don't know. This is a longer video, and I've been competing. Like I guess I could have just. I opened my window because I came back from walking my dogs, and I felt a little bit hot. And I've been competing with the sound of hedge trimmers outside the whole time. And so even that, like you can also see the hedge trimmer, like the idea that I'm giving you a product, and that it's the boundaries of my little world, and are becoming. There's a permeable boundary between my little world and the world of my neighbors who are trimming their hedges. And that there's a kind of like, as if you were to make a soup and you accidentally put hot sauce on the soup and now you can't take the hot sauce out. That this is kind of like the Neptune dynamic, is that things get kind of mixed up and permeable, and that it's like the mother who has the child attached by the umbilical cord, and everything that the mother eats, the child gets. So you can't drink alcohol when you're pregnant because you don't want to give your child alcohol poisoning. There's this kind of thing that like we're all kind of connected. Everything is connected, and that we need to have some degree of. We need to fix this problem, I think, so that people don't feel this need to go run away from society and join these crazy cults, which are not healthy. We need to make our actual society something that is feeding us with, like, healthy nutrients rather than Big Macs, which taste like cardboard, that the only reason we eat them is because we've forgotten what real food tastes like, right? And I find the only way I can talk about this is by making hour-long videos, because if I try to express this sentiment, I don't know why, but all it does is there's people that I'm already alienated from, that I don't hang out with, that react in ways that are just further alienating. That they somehow, so all I can do is just sort of make, this sort of desperate attempt to sort of communicate my perspective, and hopefully somebody out there can get, I'm not just talking, I'm not just throwing something out into a void and everybody's going to misunderstand me. Just like hopefully there's somebody out there who understands what I'm trying to say. And I don't know if I even have, I'm not, that it doesn't have to be this, it doesn't have to be this or that strip mall hell or some sort of deluded cult, that we can do something different, right? And I think maybe, at least with Pluto and maybe Pluto and Aquarius is an opportunity for this new different thing to come about. Maybe, right? This is my attempt today, and I think it's actually appropriate because talking about Neptune, that it becomes this a video like this. Why not, right? Maybe it goes with the whole the transits, right? All right. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe. Do.